So it occurred to me that despite looking at dozens of terrible games on this channel, I've never once ventured into the realm of horror. And since there are so many terrible horror games on Steam, I thought why not give one a go. Now the game in question is Stray Souls, a recently released survival horror game which, as you can see, isn't doing fantastically. Almost every review is negative, and after playing it I can see why. So without further ado, let's find out how bad this game really is. The story here actually has a fairly strong start, opening with a pretty gruesome scene consisting of a man shooting his family while he hallucinates them eating dead bodies. And while admittedly it does look a bit janky, it does a really good job of setting the tone. Unfortunately, it's about as atmospheric as the game gets. Anyway, after this, it cuts to 18 years later to Daniel moving into his recently deceased grandmother's house, and it quickly becomes apparent that Grandma wasn't a sweet old woman. In reality, she's part of a satanic cult who wants to capture Daniel when he turns 18, so she can use him in a ritual to unleash untold evil. It's then your job to go from place to place, discover the clues, and stop Granny before she can do something. Yeah, I'm not really sure. The game explains that something bad will happen, but what exactly that is or how bad it'll be, I have no idea. It's also revealed early on that Daniel's adopted, having been saved from his mother's womb after she was shot at the start. And his sister, who was also shot but survived, knew about their grandma, bought the house opposite hers knowing Daniel would move in on his 18th birthday so she could rush in and save him before it was too late.
Daniel, no!
Now, since the game never implies any dark magical force making him move, I have no idea what the plan was if Daniel didn't move in, or simply decided to sell the house instead, but I guess the story has to happen. Overall, the premise, it's alright I suppose, it's by no means the worst thing ever, but it sets you up for what looks like a pretty horrifying experience, only to deliver one that's extremely lukewarm in comparison. Beyond the first level, it never does anything that's nearly as engaging, and quite frankly, becomes really forgettable. Like, I only finished this yesterday and I'm already forgetting what happened. So much of the story is delivered in these 5-minute long exposition dumps, so when you get to the next lot of exposition, you're reminding yourself what the previous one was actually about. On top of that, so much of the story hinges on the relationship between Daniel and his sister Martha, and I have to be honest, a lot of the time, it feels very out of place. They behave far more like siblings who have grown up together, going on a family holiday, rather than two people who have just met trying to fight a literal satanic entity, and a lot of the time, their actions make literally no sense. For example, when Martha, knowing the danger Daniel's in, gives him a gun, then proceeds to abandon him so she can make a firework display for his birthday.
It's all good. But hey, look up. I have a surprise for you.
Wow, Martha, I don't know what to say.
All of this while Daniel himself is fighting off wave after wave of deformed murderous monsters. Not sure about you, but I think celebrating would be the last thing on my mind. Yeah, okay, maybe she didn't know exactly what was in the forest, but even her reaction to finding out her brother was almost torn limb from limb is far too casual.
Yeah, I'd give me that gun or it would have been monster chow.
Glad you're okay. Just stay on the path and try to avoid any more encounters if you can.
It's also worth mentioning that she finds this out pretty much instantly, and still continues to set up fireworks while Daniel himself is fighting monsters for what's implied to be hours. And it's this kind of thing that really draws you out of the moment, when these people, faced with a supposedly very dangerous situation, act like it's a mild inconvenience. Also, can we just talk about these facial animations? Yeah, the game as a whole looks pretty good, but these faces are goofy as fuck. Like, how am I supposed to take these moments seriously when they're doing this shit 24/7? So the game is broken up into several sections where you have to explore, solve puzzles and fight various enemies until you reach the last area and kill Granny. And I have to say the gameplay is actually terrible. Yeah, there's no way around it, it isn't very good. Firstly, the actual horror has been handled really badly. Don't get me wrong, there's certainly glimpses of a good scare every now and then, but as a whole it misses the mark almost entirely. A good example of this is when you first encounter your grandma, and I have to say initially it's pretty good. The atmosphere is solid and it's actually pretty scary, but the problem is they show her way too much. You see her about 10 times in half an hour, with half of those appearances being in a 5-minute period. Then after that, the game does a complete 180 and you get 4, maybe 5 jump scares over the next 6 hours. It's also worth noting they're jump scares for the sake of jump scares. Like you have a child, then a woman holding her own head? None of these are explained. At least the grandma encounters made sense. Now, I know there's a lot more to horror games than simply adding jump scares, but even then, it fails to deliver any kind of consistent atmosphere. Sure, there are parts here and there, but overall it's just kind of dull. The main problem is despite an okay start, when you gain access to the full gameplay, it more or less does a nosedive off a cliff and becomes less of a survival horror and more of a bland, glitchy mess that's more laughable than anything else. Firstly, the combat is about as bare bones as physically possible, consisting of a pistol, a dodge roll, ammo and health pickups, and that's it. No additional weapons, no inventory, no upgrades, nothing. This wouldn't be so bad if the combat was satisfying, but it isn't. You'll quickly learn that every enemy is a complete and total pushover that can barely hit you and can be taken down with minimal effort. On top of that, pickups are plentiful, meaning there is literally zero need to conserve ammo, so you just blast away non-stop until everything's dead, then move on. And as you can imagine, these elements combined pretty much guarantee that any horror that was there gets completely nullified. Although the biggest disappointment by far has to be the bosses, since they seem to be even more broken than the standard enemies, and are apparently incapable of actually hitting, let alone killing the player. And while they do have unique movesets, well, just look at this. The only one that kind of works is the grandma fight, but even then, it's not like it works well. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that the bigger and more powerful something is, the easier it is to deal with, since its moveset will almost certainly be broken beyond belief and it won't be able to hit you. So the final part of the gameplay is puzzles, and as a whole they range from either okay to downright annoying. These consist of fixing clocks, unlocking things, solving hidden messages, finding keys, and finding levers, which have all been seemingly removed and placed somewhere else for some reason. The game as a whole doesn't give you much help with these, which is fine since it's normally easy enough to work out on your own, but there is a few that fall into the category of just being a bit too vague. A good example of this is when you have to unlock some police cars but the key is missing, so you run around the cemetery for what feels like hours until you realise the location is on this innocent looking bit of paper right at the back of the map. And yeah, maybe it's me not being great at puzzles, but being told to find the lever when in reality it requires several different objectives just seems badly designed. Also, while not technically a puzzle, there's a section where you have to climb up and under some rocks to get where you're going. And while this sounds easy enough, this is the one and only time you have to do it on the final level. Sure, it's not that hard, but you'd never think to do it because you've never had to. I actually had to look up a guide because I was so confused, and given how badly it works, they could have just done away with it entirely. So by far the most off-putting part of the game are the bugs. And I'm not talking about a few, I'm talking shitloads. Stuff like Daniel not actually touching the object he's interacting with.
Feeling alright, Clarkson?
Who's a good boy? Are you the good boy? Yes,
multiple cases of clipping, getting stuck on rocks, my gun stopped working during a boss fight, enemies would get stuck in walls, and I had an ammo crate do this to me. All this means that along with the boring combat, lack of horror and mediocre puzzles, you have a seemingly never-ending wave of glitches that will either ruin the moment, or more commonly, force you to restart the game. Ironically, the biggest fear doesn't come from the monsters, spooky atmosphere or jump scares, but from when the next game-breaking bug is going to show up and undo your progress. So that was Stray Souls, and yeah, it's not great. However, I will say behind all the problems, I can see what this game could have been. The enemy designs, for example, are good, the sound design is great, and the graphics are solid, and it genuinely could have been a very good game, but as it stands, I just can't recommend it. I know a lot of the issues I've talked about are fixable, and I'm sure the developers will be implementing fixes to make the game better, but at the end of the day, I'm not sure how much that really matters. Given how saturated this genre is, so much needs adding here beyond just bug fixes, and I can't see how it's ever going to be anything more than just a very mediocre horror game. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.